My name is Officer Daniel Reyes, Homeland Security. I was born in Corpus Christi, Texas, and I spent over 3 decades serving this country. Most of that service was spent protecting borders, intercepting threats, and responding to situations that never made the evening news. You won't find my record in the open. That's by design. Men like me were used for what they called sensitive operations. Situations that could never be explained away in a press release. I never thought I would speak of this, not publicly, not where others could hear. The oath I swore, the silence I kept. It was supposed to last until the day I died. But carrying this truth has become heavier than the uniform I once wore. And now, after years of keeping it buried, I've decided to speak. Not to discredit the men I served with, not to disgrace the flag I swore to defend, but because the American people deserve to know what was really out there, hiding where they were told never to look. This isn't about border security. This isn't about drugs or cartels or anything you've heard in the news. This is about what we were told not to see, what we were ordered never to speak of again. The year was 1997. I was assigned to a rapid response unit. We weren't given much in the way of details. That was normal. Just a simple phrase in the briefing: recover and secure the cargo. That word, cargo, was used often. It stripped things of identity. Cargo could mean weapons. It could mean technology. Sometimes it meant people. But on that night, it meant something else entirely. We arrived in a remote part of South Texas, just outside of Laredo. Desert land that stretched for miles, nothing but brush and silence. No witnesses, no questions. The kind of place chosen deliberately for things that were never meant to be remembered. From the start, something felt wrong. The air was heavy, but not with heat. The kind of pressure you feel before a storm, though the sky was clear. And then there were the tracks. Indentations pressed deep into the dirt, too large for coyotes, too wide for mountain lions, too defined for cattle. I've hunted. I've tracked animals. I knew those prints didn't belong to anything listed in a field guide. The higher-ups told us not to concern ourselves. They reminded us of our orders. Contain the site. Secure the cargo. That was all. But men don't ignore instincts so easily. Every one of us knew those prints weren't natural. Something had moved through that desert. Something that watched us long before we knew it was there. And then, we found it. Not in a container, not in chains, but alive, waiting. I can still remember the sound, a low, guttural noise that vibrated through the ground more than it did the air. Some of the men froze. Others raised their weapons, but none of us fired, because what stood before us, it wasn't supposed to exist. It wasn't something you could file in a report, or photograph for evidence, or lock away in a facility. It was a living thing, and the moment we saw it, we knew it had seen us long before. What happened next was never written down in the way it unfolded. What I'm telling you now exists only in memory, because the official documents were wiped clean. The event was erased, buried beneath layers of classified files that the public will never touch. But some fragments remain. Voices caught on old recorders. A transmission intercepted before it was shut down. Pieces of the truth that slipped through their fingers. The recording you are about to hear was never meant for the public. It was never authorized for release. It was buried to keep you in the dark. But fragments survived. What you are about to hear has been hidden for almost 3 decades, and I warn you now, once you know what we found, you'll never look at the land the same way again. This is unauthorized. Viewer discretion is advised. You're listening to MindFuel. If you want the truth, if you want more than the headlines allow, subscribe, because the next chapters, they will reveal what happened that night, and why men like me were forced into silence. I need you to understand the kind of work we were trained for. Homeland security operations along the southern border weren't just about checkpoints and paperwork. They were layered. Surveillance towers equipped with high-powered optics, night patrols in unmarked vehicles, thermal imaging systems that could read the body heat of a jackrabbit 100 yards away. Every movement was logged, every crossing analyzed. We were taught to read the land like a second language, The brush, the arroyos, the dry riverbeds. They all told stories if you knew how to listen. Most breaches in the perimeter were ordinary. Smugglers testing routes. Desperate families moving at night, hoping to slip past. Sometimes armed scouts, positioned like shadows on ridges, watching our every move. But this, what we encountered that night, it wasn't ordinary. The breach came in just after midnight. A sensor tripped in an area where no one should have been moving. At first, we assumed it was a malfunction. The desert is filled with creatures that set off alarms. Wild pigs, even the larger breeds of deer. But then the thermal scopes lit up. And what we saw on those screens, it still unsettles me to this day. There were multiple signatures, not 2, not 3, but 6, scattered across the terrain, moving in unison. At first they looked like people, human-shaped, warm-blooded. But then the operator zoomed in, and the movement didn't make sense. They weren't walking upright. They were low to the ground, all fours. And the speed. No human could move that fast across desert scrub. It wasn't running. It wasn't crawling. It was something in between, unnaturally fluid, covering distance like predators built for a terrain none of us could master. The command came through the radio. Intercept. We mounted up, 3 vehicles, lights off, engines muffled to a crawl. We'd done this drill countless times before. Flank left, cut off the escape routes, tighten the net. But this time the land felt different. There was no sound of crickets, no stirring of the wind. The desert was holding its breath, waiting. As we closed in, the thermal screens flickered. One moment, 6 shapes were moving fast across the sand. The next, only 4. Then 3. Then none. Gone. As if they had dropped into the earth itself. We killed the engines and sat in silence. No one spoke, but we all felt it. The weight of something watching us. The operator tapped the screen, confused, swearing the system wasn't failing. Then, just as suddenly, the signatures returned. Not 6 this time. 8. Twice as fast, twice as close, moving around us in a wide circle. You can tell a lot about a man by the way he reacts in moments like that. Some gripped their rifles tighter. Others stared into the brush, trying to catch a glimpse of what the screens suggested. I remember our orders were clear. Engage if necessary, contain if possible. But how do you contain something you can't even see? How do you report to command that the desert itself seemed alive with bodies that vanished and reappeared at will? We advanced on foot. Flashlights were forbidden. Night vision on. Every crunch of gravel under our boots felt deafening. The tracks we followed were shallow but erratic, not like humans, not like animals. They dug deep, as if weight pressed hard into the ground, then disappeared for yards at a time before reappearing. Almost like something that didn't need to stay bound to the soil. One of the younger officers whispered over the radio, asking if we should fall back. The reply from command was ice cold. Proceed. The breach had to be secured. Whatever we were tracking, whatever was circling us, it wasn't allowed to cross that line. And so we pressed deeper into the dark. Each step taking us further away from the known and closer to something our training had never prepared us for. Because this wasn't cargo. This wasn't smugglers. This was alive, and it was moving toward us with purpose. We pushed deeper into the desert night, our formation tight, radios hissing with faint static. Each man had his night vision locked on the brush line, but it wasn't the sight of them that hit us first. It was the sound. A scream. Not quite animal, not quite human. It came low and guttural at first, like a growl dragged across stone, then broke into something that twisted upward, sharp enough to rattle your teeth. It didn't echo like a coyote. It didn't roll like a mountain lion. It stayed low to the ground, as though the earth itself carried it. Every man froze where he stood. Then came another, closer. We advanced slowly, rifles raised. And that's when we saw the first sign that this wasn't just a breach. It was a kill zone. Ahead of us, in a clearing of brittle grass and sand, we found livestock, or what was left of them. Cattle, torn apart with a precision that didn't match any predator we knew. The bodies weren't eaten, not in the way coyotes or scavengers would strip them. These were shredded, as if something had moved through them with no purpose but destruction. Ribs split open, flesh scattered across the dirt. One of the younger men muttered a prayer under his breath. The stench was suffocating. Blood baked under desert heat smells different. It carries, it clings. And in that silence, every man there understood we weren't looking at cartel violence. No machete, no weapon, just force. Pure, unnatural force. I raised my radio. "Command, this is Reyes. We've got multiple livestock down, signs of aggressive movement. Requesting confirmation on..." Before I could finish, another voice cut across the channel. Officer Torres, one of our scouts, barely whispering. "Sir, it's watching us." The channel went dead quiet. No one moved. Then another voice crackled in. 11 o'clock, by the mesquite brush. Something's there. We turned as one, rifles up, and for the first time that night we broke protocol. Someone hit a light. A beam cut across the brush, jagged shadows bending, and there it was. Eyes. 2 of them. Reflective, catching the light. But they didn't shine like animal eyes. They didn't flare back red or yellow. They glowed pale, silver white. And when they blinked, they didn't blink like ours. The lids moved sideways. Every man saw it. Every man froze. And then, in the breath before anyone could react, it moved. The brush exploded, branches snapping as something massive charged forward. The ground shook under its weight, and that guttural scream tore out again. Closer, deafening, carrying fury and hunger in the same note. "Fire!" someone shouted, and rifles cracked open the night. Muzzle flashes lit the desert in violent bursts, cutting through the dark like lightning. The thing didn't fall. It didn't stumble. It moved through the hail of bullets as though the rounds I remember the chaos like snapshots burned into my mind. Boots pounding the sand, brass casings spilling from rifles. That blinding reflection of silver eyes weaving between the bursts of gunfire. And then, all at once, silence. The radio's cut, every channel dead, just static, no command, no orders, just the sound of our own breath, and somewhere out there in the dark, the steady, deliberate movement of something circling us again. When the firing stopped, the desert was heavier than silence. A few of us were still standing. Others didn't move at all. We pulled back in formation, dragging the injured, hearts pounding against the weight of what we had just faced. Not a single man spoke the word human. Not one of us said animal. Because there wasn't a word that fit what came out of that brush. We loaded into the vehicles, engines roaring, radios still flooded with static. It wasn't until we cleared 3 miles of desert that the channels returned. The voice of command broke through, flat and unshaken, as if they had been waiting. "Report!" I gave them the truth. Multiple casualties, livestock torn apart, contact with an unidentified entity. But the reply was as sharp as a blade. It was a coyote pack. Do you understand? Every man in that convoy stared at one another. Coyotes don't move like that. They don't tear through steel. And yet the order was clear. Sign the paperwork. Swear to it. Coyotes. That was the story. That was all. When we reached the outpost, the evidence was undeniable. The side of one of our vehicles had been ripped open. Not dented, not scratched. Ripped. Thick steel plating torn through like it was aluminum foil. Claw marks carving trenches into the frame. I remember the mechanic who first saw it. His face went pale, and within minutes, men in plain uniforms had pulled a tarp over it and wheeled it away. By morning, it was gone. Forensics was brought in, or at least, men calling themselves forensics. They weren't dressed like our teams. No insignias, no names. They collected shell casings, blood samples, even soil. Not a word was spoken to us. Every scrap of evidence we thought we had was taken. And then, the desert itself was scrubbed clean. They burned the brush where the attack had happened. They brought in trucks, dragging chains through the sand to erase the tracks. It wasn't just about hiding what had occurred. It was about erasing the memory from the land itself. By the time they were finished, the site looked untouched, as if nothing had ever lived or died there. Some of the men refused to sign. They wanted to speak the truth. One of them, still trembling, swore he had heard something during the chaos. He said in the middle of the gunfire, when the radios screamed with static, he heard a voice break through. Not human, not fully formed, but clear enough to freeze his blood. A single word. Go. He said it wasn't shouted, it wasn't screamed, it was spoken, deliberate. As if whatever we faced that night wasn't just hunting, it was warning. Command didn't want to hear it. They pressed the paperwork across the table. Coyotes. That was the final word. Sign and walk away. Most did. Some broke down crying before the ink dried. Because we all knew, once you put your name on it, you would bury. It was about control. About shaping what the public could and could not know. And from that day on, I understood. Whatever lived in those deserts, it wasn't just hidden from us. It was protected. I left that night carrying more than the weight of memory. I carried documents I wasn't supposed to have. Not much, just a folder thin enough to slip into the lining of my bag. But inside were fragments that told me the truth didn't begin or end with us. Years later, after I resigned my post, I opened them fully for the first time. Most were redacted beyond recognition, thick black lines covering names and dates. But in the margins, in overlooked notes, I found what no briefing had ever told us. Audio transcripts, grainy, distorted. Field reports from operations just like mine, stretching back decades. And every one of them ended the same way. Casualties unexplained, evidence confiscated, the cause listed as animal attack. But buried in those transcripts were details that didn't fit any coyote, any predator that walks on four legs. One audio log, dated 1974, recorded the voice of a shaken patrolman. He described seeing figures moving along the Rio Grande under the cover of night. At first, they looked like migrants crossing, a routine sight. But when they called out, the figures stopped. And then, they answered. The voices weren't right. Too hollow, too perfect. A mimicry of human speech that carried no life behind it. The patrolmen swore their limbs were elongated, their arms bending at angles no body could hold. And when he opened fire, the radio cut to static, just as ours had. His report was sealed under Class of Classified Wildlife Interaction. Another file contained maps, sections of the border marked with heavy red circles. At first, I thought they were simply zones of cartel activity, but they weren't marked as danger zones. They were labeled No Patrol, entire stretches of land where agents were never to set foot. No explanation. No training manual ever mentioned them. To recruits, they were just gaps in the system. But to those who knew, they were something else. As I pieced the documents together, the truth grew colder with every page. We weren't securing a border. That's what the public believed. That's what the men in uniforms were told. But what we were really doing was containing something else. Something older than the fences, older than the watchtowers. Something that had lived in those deserts long before men came with rifles and flags. The patrols weren't there to keep people out. They were there to keep what was inside from getting out. There was one night that will never leave me, the largest breach I ever witnessed. The night when everything we thought we understood about those deserts collapsed. It started with motion sensors, every alarm lighting up across nearly 5 miles of desert at once. No smuggler caravan could move like that. No animals could coordinate in that way. Yet one after another, the sensors tripped, a chain of red blips spreading across the monitor like fire jumping through dry brush. Command dispatched 3 teams immediately, 24 men, all trained, all armed, and only 1 team came back. I remember the panic in the operations center. Radios screamed with overlapping chatter, then cut to silence. Monitors flickered with static. And then, through the interference, a single feed pushed through. Night vision footage from a helmet cam. The screen showed the desert floor, brush trembling, sand scattering in bursts. Shapes emerged at the edge of the frame. Not men, not animals. They crawled upright, elongated bodies staggering forward like shadows too tall to belong to flesh. And then, as if some unseen signal passed among them, they dropped, on all fours, moving with a speed that no lens could properly follow. The sound came next. A shriek, not of hunger, not of pain, but of something else. It rose high enough to pierce, deep enough to shake the frame itself. Body cams caught it. The feed shuddered, cracked, warped until the images bent into green blur. One by one, the cameras failed, each scream rattling them into silence. When the footage cut out, the room went cold. Everyone in that center knew what it meant. We had lost contact. Hours later, only 1 team stumbled back across the perimeter, bloodied, silent, faces pale, eyes wide and unblinking. They carried no bodies, no evidence, no words, just a silence heavier than any report. When they finally spoke, their voices were broken. They didn't describe an ambush. They didn't describe feeding. They described erasure. They didn't kill to eat, one officer said. They killed to silence. Command filed the event as an equipment failure. The footage vanished. The logs were purged. But I remember the look in those men's eyes. I remember their trembling hands as they signed their names to a story that wasn't true. And that was the night I realized something unspoken. These creatures weren't just defending territory. They weren't hunting for survival. They were making sure we never carried the truth back out of the desert alive. I shouldn't even be speaking these words. Every second my voice is recorded, I'm gambling with the last years I've got. I'm not naive. They'll hear this eventually. They'll trace it. And when they do, I'll vanish the same way the others did. That's why I'm in hiding now. That's why I'll never use my real name again. For decades, I've watched DHS quietly reroute patrols, staging drug busts that never happened to cover for agents who never came back. They'll say a convoy intercepted contraband. They'll say an officer was injured in a cartel ambush. But I've seen the reports stripped bare. No suspects. No drugs recovered. Just a void where men used to be. They want you to believe every trail of blood in that desert belongs to smugglers or gangs. But I'm telling you now, if you find blood in the sand, it's not always cartel violence. Sometimes it's something else. Something with no name in the reports, no photograph in the evidence locker, no story for the newspapers to print. I live with the memory of those eyes, silver, reflective, lids that moved sideways. I live with the sound of that scream shaking the night vision feeds until they snapped. And worst of all, I live with the moment it turned toward me. Because I looked one in the face, close enough to feel its breath, close enough to know it saw me as more than a target. It remembered me. That's why I can't go home. That's why I can't trust anyone in uniform. Because if these things can remember, if they can choose, then one day it will come back for me. And those who tried to bury the truth will let it happen. Because for them, silence is worth more than the lives of the men who served. The file you've been hearing wasn't meant for the public. It wasn't meant for anyone outside the chain of command, yet it surfaced briefly, circulating on encrypted boards, whispered about in corners of the internet no one admits visiting. The date stamped on it, August 2023. And here's the part no report will tell you. After this testimony was recorded, the officer who leaked it vanished. No resignation letter, no trace in federal payroll, no family statement, just gone. What remained was this final fragment, a voice, distorted with static, breaking through the hum of the desert airwaves. A single warning before silence swallowed it. They're not crossing into America. They're already here. Then, nothing. Just the sound of wind across sand, carrying secrets no patrol will ever write down. But the story doesn't end here, because buried deeper in the archives is another case, sealed tighter than this one. A set of documents labeled only with one phrase: the Border Patrol files. The next testimony speaks of something hidden beneath Arizona, something the reports call the nest. And if the first file was a warning, what comes next may be a countdown.